Disclaimer: this story isn't mine, but it's my stepdad's, whose name is actually Jeff. Jeff, who was about 16 at that time, was outside of our home in northern Illinois taking care of the lawn for his folks. His street was one of those weird ones where you could only park on half of it going either way, so at the end of each block you had a long stretch of no parking. Anyway, his buddy pulled up across the street from his house where you could park and called Jeff over. Jeff crossed the street and leaned into his friend's car and started talking. The conversation turned to an invite to a party that night at another friend's house. Booze would be involved. Jeff turned his head and noticed a really nice sports car parked in the wrong area facing the fence, with a gentleman inside just staring at them from a distance. They both thought it strange, but neither of them really paid any attention, and they set their plans for his buddy to come back later and pick him up. He waved goodbye and he drove off. Now it's important to note that at this point in time, Jeff was holding a long broom in his hands from cleaning up the sidewalk and driveway. The car from before sped up to where his buddy had been parked and beckoned Jeff over to his car. Jeff stood outside his window with the broom in his hand. The guy introduced himself as new in town and was looking for some company for a movie night at his house to get to know the community. Jeff, feeling uneasy and subsequently having plans, explained to the guy that he had to go to his grandmother's house later that night. The man then gripped his steering wheel tightly, we're talking white knuckles, and talked directly at it. "Why? Just come over." After a while of Jeff resisting him and him getting more and more upset, now Jeff knows something isn't right and has now grabbed the broomstick tightly and backed away from the car. The guy then reaches into his back seat and pulls out a bag of liquor and holds it tightly before hitting the gas and barreling out of sight. Fast forwards 5 years and Jeff is now freshly 21 and dealing with his first and only DUI. While he was waiting for his attorney to see him, Jeff sees the man on the front of a magazine with the name Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeff walks into the office and holds up the magazine and explains to the lawyer what had happened to him 5 years prior. The lawyer was flabbergasted and they ended up talking about it instead of his DUI. Stepdad almost became a victim of Jeffrey Dahmer. When I was a teenager, I was goth. Black hair, black clothes, black makeup, even had a pair of combat boots. My friends and I, in a typical goth fashion, hang out at a local cemetery. We started going as a joke, but soon discovered we liked the peace we found there. That all changed one night. My friend called to see if I wanted to hang out, and I did. None of our other friends were available. They were either working or recovering from partying the night before, so we were on our own. My friend picked me up and we drove up to the cemetery. We were hanging out, smoking cigs and BSing about the latest issues she was having with her boyfriend, when we noticed at the top of the hill we were on, about 100 feet away, a bonfire had been lit. You have to understand that this cemetery is about a block off campus of a major university, and it's not uncommon for college students to go there to party. My friend and I sighed, knowing that we would have to get going soon. It was illegal to be in a cemetery after dark, and we knew the police would show up because some jerks had decided they needed a bonfire. We decided to finish our cigs and then take off. Just then, the most horrible stench came wafting down the hill from the direction of the bonfire. My friend gagged and covered her mouth. I groaned and I said, "What the hell?" My friend shook her head, saying, "I don't know what they're doing. Let's just leave." We get in the car and one of us adjusted, I honestly don't remember who, Maybe we should just go up and see what they're doing. My stomach turned and a cold shiver went through my body. My friend must have had the same feeling because at that same time we both said, no, we should leave. My friend turned the car on, switched on her headlights, put the car in reverse and looked over her shoulder before starting to back up. I was still looking up the hill. A figure stepped in front of the bonfire. I could only see a silhouette, but I was sure whoever it was watching us. A feeling of terror hit me and I said, "Go, go, go!" getting louder and more panicked with each word. My friend looked back up the hill for a second, and just as the figure took a step towards us, she slammed on the gas and peeled out, going in reverse down the hill. She rammed the gear shift into drive and we were out. We didn't say anything for a while until she said, "What the hell were they burning?" I shook my head. "I don't know." She dropped me off at home and I went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and went out to the kitchen. My mom was there drinking her morning coffee and I joined her. We talked about her job for a bit when she suddenly comes out with, "Do you hear what happened last night?" I shrug and say, "No, I had just gotten up." Then she tells me that a woman she worked with was kidnapped from the parking garage. "Oh my God," I said. "Did they find her?" "Yes, but too late," she replies. "Whoever took her had murdered her. They found her this morning up in the cemetery. He had tried to dispose of her body in a bonfire." I froze. My brain was going a mile a minute, the realization slowly creeping up. That's what that smell was. Needless to say, I never hung out at the cemetery at night again. I think back to our decision to leave instead of investigating the fire. That one decision could have changed everything. Dark silhouette in the bonfire? Let's not meet. I told my daughter this story the other day, thanks to being a little too inebriated on a bottle of white wine. And she told me about this subreddit and begged me to tell you about it. My name is Jennifer, and I've been a casual Redditor for a long time now. Mostly I just like browsing pics and looking up cooking recipes. I've never been much for the creepy stuff and I don't normally engage in threads on Ask Reddit, so this is new for me. This happened in 1985 when I was 17 years old. I was the youngest of my graduating class and all summer I had been looking at colleges across the region. This is long enough ago that there wasn't any internet. And if you wanted to go to college out of state and you didn't have tons of money or connections, you'd actually have to take a trip. I was born in Seattle, but at this time my family had been living in Mount Shasta, which is a small town in Northern California. I wasn't able to attend college on time with the rest of my friends because I ended up having to stay home and take care of my mother. She ended up being diagnosed with cancer at the end of summer, and my dad had to continue working 10-hour days in order to pay the bills. So I took care of my mom for a year while dad worked. Luckily, my mom didn't have to suffer for long. The cancer had progressed so far by the time they caught it that she passed in the fall. After my mom passed away, my dad made sure I started college as soon as possible. I knew I wanted to go to school in Seattle because the big city life was calling to me. Dad basically handed me $500 and the keys to his old 1982 Chevrolet pickup and told me to go. And that when I got there, he'd send me money to get an apartment so I could make my way in the city before school started. He didn't want any obstacles in my way when it came to school. He felt guilty for having kept me home while Mom was dying. Not that I would have chosen to be anywhere else, but he was still feeling guilty. So in the middle of fall, I ended up driving my dad's truck north to Seattle. The trip is basically straight shot from Mount Shasta to Seattle on Interstate 5. It should have been easy, but about halfway through Oregon, the pickup broke down. A coolant hose sprung a leak and I was unable to repair it on the side of the road. Yes, back then, girls from small towns knew about cars. So I ended up walking on the side of the interstate northward in the direction of the next town. I had just passed a small town named Greene a while back, and the map said I was just south of a medium-sized town named Roseburg. I couldn't be sure how far away from Roseburg I was, but walking wasn't a problem for me, and Roseburg would be much more likely to have a repair shop, so even if it might be further away, it was totally worth the attempt. It was cold that evening, and the wind chill was cutting through my coat and causing me to hate life. I decided it would be best to hitch a ride to Roseburg since it was getting dark quickly. I thought I looked pretty hot back then, but even still, no one stopped to give me a lift. I kept walking north and putting my thumb out every time a car came up behind me. It was hours later when one finally stopped. It was a big red 18-wheeler that had no trailer attached. It pulled up in front of me and off to the side of the road and honked its horn. I ran up to the truck, thankful that I could finally get out of the wind. As I opened the passenger side door of the truck, I saw a very friendly-looking man at the wheel. He smiled and said, "Come on up inside," as I climbed into the passenger seat. He told me his name was Rick, and I introduced myself in turn. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him I needed to get to Roseburg to get a tow truck to pick up my vehicle I left a few miles back. He told me he'd been to Roseburg many times on his routes, and there wasn't a repair shop or tow truck company open this late at night. He told me he would let me out at a motel so that I could sleep the night and then get the tow truck to pick my vehicle up the next morning. I thank him for his considerate nature. He really did seem kind and thoughtful. We weren't far from Roseburg, according to him, which made sense because we could just now begin seeing the signs of civilization amongst the trees on the side of the interstate. We made small talk while he drove the rest of the way. We discussed cold weather, current events, and even sports. Somewhere in the conversation, he told me that I was very pretty. It caught me off guard, but he didn't say it in a creepy manner, so I merely thanked him and continued talking about sports. He didn't say anything after that, kind of just let me talk. You know that feeling you get when you realize you've been chatting on and on about something and the other person hasn't said a word for a few minutes? Well, I got that feeling because he hadn't said a word since he told me I was pretty. I stopped and apologized for being so chatty and taking his ear off. He looked at me and smiled and said it was alright. He likes to hear my pretty voice. That time he did say it in a creepy way, but sometimes that happens. I doubted he meant to do that. I kept quiet in hopes that he'd start talking and we'd discuss something else. Instead, we didn't say a word. He watched the road and I just sat there. In a minute, I began looking around the cab and I ended up looking in the back of the cab behind me. What I saw puzzled me. In the back, there was a large brown blanket. Some clothes I'm sure were dirty and some shoes. The thing that puzzled me was they weren't all his clothes and shoes. 2 pairs of shoes were obviously little girl shoes and some of the clothes were little girl's clothes. Something you'd expect a 10-year-old to wear. He knew I had seen it and laughed. He told me his daughter left those in the cab after she had accompanied him on a route last week. He told me he didn't get enough time to spend with her, so he took her on a route a week ago to spend some quality time together. I said that was nice of him and asked how old she was. He paused for a second and then told me she was 13. That made me suspicious because not only did he hesitate before answering, but I've worked in a shoe store before and I know those shoes must belong to a much younger girl. Both because of the size and the style. It also didn't seem like the kind of clothes or shoes you'd have a little girl bring on a trip like this. It was weird but not scary. Also, having worked at a shoe store before, I was almost positive those shoes were two different sizes. I told him the shoes were cute and leaned back and grabbed one of them and proved to myself that they had to be different sizes. In no way does a little girl wear two totally different sizes. Still, I wasn't really scared. I just thought he wasn't being totally honest, and that's his business, so I didn't really mind it. It's just a weird thing to be dishonest about, even to a stranger. I put the shoe back, and when I turned around, I saw the look on his face. He seemed half worried and half angry. I immediately apologized for touching his things, and he said it was okay, although it didn't look okay. By then, we were just entering Roseburg. We kept driving through the town, and he told me he knew a good motel on the far end of town, and he'd let me off there. He asked me what I'd brought with me in my backpack. It seemed like an innocent question, but it came off like he was interested in what I had on me. Not simply whether or not I brought any clothes or a toothbrush. I told him I had enough, but I didn't tell him anything specific about the contents of my backpack. I didn't have a weapon of any type, just some socks, makeup, and my purse. We ended up passing a repair shop on the side of the road, and he pointed to it and told me that's the place I should go tomorrow morning to get a tow truck. It felt kind of strange to me because he didn't tell me it was coming up. He just pointed it out. I said I had missed it and asked what the name of the shop was. He responded by just telling me it was straight south of the interstate and I can't miss it, as if he didn't remember the name. At this point, I began to get a little worried. I didn't feel threatened by Rick, but he didn't seem to be legit. As we kept driving, I noticed we were now coming to the far north end of Roseburg and that soon we'd be leaving the town behind. I asked him where this motel is and he told me it was just north of town. I told him that was a little far from the repair shop for me and asked if there was any place closer for me to stay. He didn't answer. Now I'm a little worried about Rick's intentions for me. I got my backpack and put it in my lap. He looked over and saw it and asked if I was okay. I looked over and smiled at him and told him I was okay, just cold. Do you know those signs on the highway that tell you how far off the next rest stop, gas station, or motel is? Well, they had those back then too, but usually only on the outskirts of a town. It's the town's way of motivating you to stop for gas or lodging, know where they can tax it, rather than continuing on and sleeping somewhere unincorporated. Well, we came up on one of those signs. It said there wouldn't be a motel for 20 miles and we were leaving Roseburg. I knew then that Rick wasn't taking me to a motel just past the town's limit. I didn't know what he wanted, but I didn't want it to happen. I looked over slowly at Rick, and luckily he hadn't seen the sign, I think, because he was busy lighting a cigarette. I began looking frantically out the window to see if there were any places I could make an excuse to stop at. Maybe I could ask to stop at a gas station for something to drink and then run away. There wasn't one open. I decided I'd have to pull out the big guns and ask him to pull over so I could pee. I looked over at him and asked if he'd pull over to let me pee on the side of the road. He pulled his lit cigarette out of his mouth and looked at me. He asked, "You gotta pee?" And I shook my head, yes. "Well, go ahead and pee then, Jenny," he told me. I liked the smell. And he smiled at me and it sent shivers down my spine. I pretended to laugh and he frowned at me. He told me, "Don't laugh at me, Jenny." I immediately stopped pretending to be fine and so did Rick. He could tell I was scared now and he just gave me this look like he wanted to hit me. I asked him where we were going and he told me not to worry about that. At this point I could actually see the end of Roseburg coming up ahead. No more lights after that, just woods. Immediately I heard my dad's voice in my head telling me to run, not to worry about getting hurt, just run. I opened the door and tried to jump out. The truck must have been moving at 30 to 40 miles per hour, and as I moved towards the open door, Rick grabbed my backpack. He had been trying to grab me, but I was pressed against the far end of the cab. I heard my dad's voice again telling me to run and tried to pull my backpack away from Rick, but his grip was too strong. I gave up and just fell out of the cab and into the grass. The impact knocked the wind out of me and I rolled around in the grass till I came to a stop. Immediately I sat up despite the sharp pain in my back and saw Rick's truck speeding up on his way out of the town. He didn't stop. I got up and limped my way back into town and ran up to the first home I saw and pounded on the front door. An old man opened the door looking very tired yet also very worried. I begged him to call the cops, and when he saw the bruises on my face and the grass stains on my clothes, he threw open the door and let me come in. He sat me on the couch while he ran to the phone. His wife came down to find me on the couch crying, and him on the phone telling the local sheriff to come as soon as possible. She got me a glass of water and a blanket. They were both so nice to me. The sheriff arrived and expected me to be drunk at first. About halfway through my story, he realized that I wasn't drunk and there was truth to the story I was telling. He called up 2 deputies who were asleep at home and had them patrol north on the interstate looking for a big red 18-wheeler. He even called up the next town north and asked them to send a patrol south. They didn't find any red 18-wheelers on the road, but they assumed he'd probably sped his way right through their town too because they were able to send out a patrol. The nice old couple who had let me in ended up letting me stay with them. The sheriff kept a deputy outside of the house all night. The next day, he took me to the station to fill out an official report and look at some photos of 18-wheelers so I could pick out the exact color and model. He drove me to the repair shop, which just happened to be the same one Rick pointed out to me. He had them tow my truck in and had the sheriff's department pay for it. They got my dad's pickup running in no time at all, and the sheriff asked me to stay in town for a few more nights. I was totally fine with that because I didn't want to meet Rick on the road again. I stayed at the old couple's home for 3 more nights and spent my days with the sheriff as we patrolled the interstate and called nearby towns asking if any truckers had been pulled over matching my description. I did stay in contact with the sheriff and the old couple who helped me. The old couple both passed away about a year and a half later. I went to their funerals and spoke to their kids, who were about my dad's age at that time, and told them everything their parents had done for me. They were very proud of their parents. I even stayed at their home on my way back down from Seattle when I eventually brought my dad's truck back to him. The sheriff would call me from time to time and ask if he could send me some photos. It seemed every few months he would arrest a trucker who had a red semi or a similar vehicle and he would want to see if I recognized him. He says that Rick probably didn't frequent that route as much as he said he did because he didn't seem too familiar with the town, which is one reason I was suspicious of him. Odds are, Rick was a crazy serial killer or at least a child abductor and sexual predator. But he travels the whole United States and there is no way to know where he is now. At that time, I suspected he was around 40, which means he would be in his 70s now and probably no longer on the road. The sheriff told me many years later that there are tons of old folks in retirement homes who have no families and no one ever visits them. And Rick is probably living that kind of life now if he's still alive. Wherever Rick is now, I hope he never really hurt anyone, or at least I hope he never hurt anyone ever again. But if he did, especially if he did hurt the 2 little girls whose clothes he had in his truck, then I hope that wherever he is, he's suffering and alone. We never did find Rick.